He was just trying to survive another ordinary Tuesday when he heard those 4 words that would shatter his world and rebuild it in the same breath. "Daddy, we found Mommy." What his twin daughters discovered in that forgotten corner of town would unlock a mystery that had haunted their family for 3 agonizing years. The woman who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a father's breaking heart, was about to step back into their lives in the most unexpected way. But when he finally saw her face, when the impossible became real, his legs gave out beneath him. The tears wouldn't stop. The pain, the hope, the overwhelming flood of emotions he'd buried so deep, it all came rushing back in waves that nearly destroyed him. This is the story of how love finds a way, even when hope seems lost forever, and how sometimes the smallest voices can lead us home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning alarm at 6:15 a.m. had become Emmett Vance's most faithful companion, reliable, persistent, and utterly without mercy. He rolled over in the king-sized bed that felt too big, too empty, and reached across the knitstand to silence the shrill reminder that another day had begun. 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days since Caitlin had vanished from their lives, leaving behind only questions that had no answers and a silence that echoed through every corner of their home in Thornfield, Michigan. The house on Maple Grove Avenue was a beautiful 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch that Caitlin had fallen in love with the moment they'd first seen it. She'd stood in the front yard, hands pressed to her chest, eyes bright, with dreams of hanging flower baskets and watching their daughters play in the sprawling backyard. Now the flower baskets hung empty and swaying in the October wind, and the only sound from the backyard was the lonely creak of the swing set that rarely saw use anymore. Emmett swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the cold hardwood floor. At 34, he looked older than his years. His dark hair, once carefully styled for his job as a civil engineer at the county planning office, now showed premature silver at the temples. His green eyes, which Caitlin used to say sparkled like emeralds when he laughed, had dulled to the color of winter grass. The laugh lines around his eyes had deepened, but not from joy, from the constant strain of holding everything together when he felt like he was falling apart. Down the hall, he could hear the soft murmur of voices from the twins' room. Lily and Rose, his 7-year-old daughters, were already awake, whispering to each other in that secret language that twins seemed to share. They'd been 4 when their mother disappeared, old enough to remember her laugh, her bedtime stories, the way she'd braid their hair with infinite patience every morning, but young enough to still ask, with heartbreaking innocence, when Mommy was coming home. The questions had stopped about a year ago, not because the girls had forgotten, but because they'd learned to read the pain in their father's eyes every time they asked. 7-year-olds, Emmett had discovered, were far more perceptive than most adults gave them credit for. They'd learned to carry their grief quietly, protectively, as if they understood that their father was barely holding on as it was. He pulled on his robe and padded down the hallway, pausing at their door. Through the crack, he could see them, sitting cross-legged on Rose's bed, their heads bent together over something. Lily, with her mother's golden hair and serious expression, was showing Rose a drawing she'd made. Rose, darker-haired like him but with Caitlin's bright smile, was nodding earnestly at whatever her sister was explaining. "Good morning, angels," Emmett said softly, pushing the door open. Both girls looked up, and he was struck, as he was every morning, by how much they looked like their mother. The shape of their eyes, the way they tilted their heads when they were thinking, the gentle curve of their smiles. It was like seeing ghosts of the woman he'd lost. "Morning, Daddy," they chorused, and Rose hopped up to wrap her arms around his waist. Lily followed, more reserved but no less loving, and for a moment, The three of them stood in the morning light filtering through the white curtains, holding onto each other like they were afraid to let go. "What were you two plotting in here?" he asked, trying to inject some lightness into his voice. "We weren't plotting," Lily said seriously. "We were planning." "Planning what?" The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks. "It's a surprise," Rose said, grinning. "But it's a good one, Daddy. We promise." Emmett felt his chest tighten. The girls had been full of surprises lately, surprise breakfasts that ended with flour everywhere, surprise art projects that used up all the construction paper, surprise tea parties with their stuffed animals. He knew they were trying to make him smile, trying to fill the spaces where their mother's laughter used to live. It broke his heart that two 7-year-olds felt responsible for their father's happiness. "Well, I can't wait to see what you're up to," he said, kissing the top of each head. "But first, let's get ready for school. Mrs. Patterson will be here in an hour." Mrs. Patterson was their elderly neighbor who'd become an unofficial grandmother to the girls after Caitlin disappeared. She watched them before school while Emmett got ready for work, and she was there when they got home in the afternoons. She'd been a godsend, but she was also a reminder of everything that had changed, everything that was missing. The morning routine was a well-choreographed dance they'd perfected over the years. Emmett showered while the girls got dressed then. He made breakfast while they brushed their teeth and packed their backpacks. Today was pancakes. Tuesday was always pancakes, because Caitlin used to make them shaped like animals, and the girls had begged him to continue the tradition. His pancakes didn't look like elephants or butterflies. They looked like circles, sometimes lopsided ones, but the girls never complained. They ate them with syrup and orange juice, chattering about their plans for the day, their friends at school, their upcoming Halloween costumes. Normal conversation from normal kids living a normal life, except for the careful way they avoided mentioning the empty chair at the table. "Are you picking us up today, or is Mrs. Patterson?" Lily asked, cutting her pancakes into precise squares. "I'll be there," Emmett said, checking his watch. "I have a site visit this morning, but I should be back by 3. Can we go to the park after school?" Rose asked hopefully. "The leaves are really pretty now." Emmett nodded, though the park held its own painful memories. It was where he'd proposed to Caitlin 6 years ago, on a bench overlooking the duck pond. It was where they'd brought the girls when they were toddlers, where Caitlin had taught them to feed the ducks without scaring them away. But it was also where the girls seemed happiest, where they could run and laugh without the weight of the house's silence pressing down on them. "Sure, sweetheart. We can go to the park." Mrs. Patterson arrived at 7:30, bustling through the front door with her usual energy. She was 73, with silver hair that she kept in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been married to her husband for 52 years before he passed, and she treated Emmett and the girls like the family she'd never had. "How are my favorite girls this morning?" she asked, and Lily and Rose rushed to hug her. "We have a surprise," Rose whispered conspiratorially, "but it's a secret." "Oh, I love secrets," Mrs. Patterson said, winking at Emmett. "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone." Emmett kissed the girls goodbye, grabbed his work bag and keys, and headed out into the crisp October morning. The drive to the county office took him through downtown Thornfield, past the coffee shop where he and Caitlin used to meet for lunch, past the bookstore where she'd spent Saturday mornings browsing the mystery section, past the small park where they'd gotten married in a simple ceremony with just their families and closest friends. Every street held memories. Every corner whispered her name. Sometimes he wondered if he should move, take the girls somewhere new where the past wouldn't follow them. But this was their home, and despite the pain, it was also where all the happy memories lived. He couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the place where she might still somehow find her way back to them. At work, he threw himself into blueprints and zoning reports, anything to keep his mind occupied. But even there, surrounded by the familiar chaos of the planning office. He found himself checking his phone every few minutes, not for messages who would message him, but for the time. Always counting down the hours until he could see his daughters again, until he could hold them close and remember that he wasn't completely alone. He had no idea that in a few hours, his world would change forever. That his daughter's mysterious planning would lead to a discovery that would bring him to his knees. That the woman he'd mourned for 3 years was closer than he'd ever imagined. And that sometimes, the greatest miracles come in the smallest. Packages wrapped in the voices of 2 little girls who'd never stopped believing in impossible things. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Elementary as Emmett pulled into the pickup line at 3:15 p.m. He could see Lily and Rose waiting by the flagpole, their matching purple backpacks slung over their shoulders, heads bent together in another one of their whispered conversations. Even from a distance, he could tell they were excited about something. Their body language radiated barely contained energy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daddy, Rose called out as she climbed into the back seat, her cheeks flushed with excitement. We need to go somewhere special today. The park, remember? Lily added, but there was something different in her voice. Usually she was the more cautious twin, the one who thought things through carefully. Today, she seemed almost breathless with anticipation. Of course the park, Emmett said, adjusting his rearview mirror to look at them. But you two seem unusually excited. Did something happen at school? The twins exchanged another one of their meaningful looks. Not at school, Rose said carefully. But we have something really important to show you. At the park? Emmett asked, starting the engine. Near the park, Lily corrected. There's a place we found yesterday when Mrs. Patterson took us for a walk. We wanted to show you then, but ... She trailed off, suddenly looking uncertain. But what, sweetheart? But we needed to make sure first, Rose finished. We needed to be really sure, Emmett felt a flutter of unease. The twins had been more secretive than usual lately, and while he'd attributed it to typical 7-year-old mischief, something in their voices today was different. There was an intensity, an urgency that made him glance at them again in the mirror. Sure about what? He asked gently. You'll see, Lily said, and for the first time in months, there was something that looked like hope in her serious brown eyes. The drive to Riverside Park, no, that wasn't right. The drive to Maplewood Park took 10 minutes through the tree-lined streets of Thornfield. The leaves were at their peak, blazing red and gold against the October sky, and normally Emmett would have pointed out the beauty to the girls. Today, he was too focused on the strange energy radiating from the back seat. When they arrived at the park, instead of heading toward the playground as usual, the twins led him in the opposite direction. They walked with purpose, their small hands firmly gripping his, leading him down a path he'd never noticed before. The trail wound through a grove of oak trees, their branches creating a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the ground. Where exactly are we going? Emmett asked, but the girls just squeezed his hands tighter. It's not far, Rose said. Just past the old bridge. The old bridge was a small stone crossing over a creek that ran behind the park. Emmett had seen it before, but never paid much attention. It was probably built in the 1940s, moss-covered and forgotten by most visitors. The girls led him across it, their footsteps echoing softly on the worn stones. On the other side, a narrow path continued through the woods. After about 50 yards, they came to a small clearing where an old building stood partially hidden by overgrown vines and drooping willow branches. It looked like it had once been a caretaker's cottage or maybe a small ranger station, but it had clearly been abandoned for years. Girls, we shouldn't be here, Emmett said, his parental instincts kicking in. This looks like private property. "It's okay, Daddy," Lily said with unusual confidence. "Mrs. Patterson said it used to be part of the park. They just don't use it anymore." "But that's not what we wanted to show you," Rose added, practically bouncing with excitement. "It's what's inside." Before Emmett could stop them, both girls had darted toward the cottage. The front door hung slightly ajar, its green paint peeling and faded. Through the gaps in the vines, he could see windows that were surprisingly clean, as if someone had been caring for the place. "Lily! Rose! Come back here," he called, but they had already disappeared through the doorway. He had no choice but to follow them. As he approached the cottage, he could hear voices from inside his daughter's excited whispers, and something else. Something that made his heart stop. A woman's voice. Soft, familiar, speaking in low tones that he couldn't quite make out. Emmett's hand trembled as he pushed the door open wider. The interior of the cottage was dim, lit only by the late afternoon sun filtering through the clean windows. Someone had been living here. There was a small cot in the corner, neatly made with a patchwork quilt. A few books stacked on a wooden crate that served as a table. A camp stove on what looked like a makeshift kitchen counter. But what stopped him cold was the scene in the center of the room. Lily and Rose were kneeling beside a woman who sat in an old wooden chair, her hands covering her face. She was wearing a faded blue dress that he recognized, though it was more worn than he remembered. Her hair was longer, streaked with gray that hadn't been there before, and her frame was thinner than it used to be, but he knew that silhouette. He knew the way she held her shoulders, the gentle curve of her neck, the way her hands moved when she was overwhelmed. "Mommy," Rose was saying softly, patting the woman's arm. "We brought Daddy, just like we promised." The woman's hands slowly fell away from her face, and Emmett saw the eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. Caitlin's eyes, older and sadder than he remembered, but unmistakably hers. She looked up at him, and her face crumpled with an emotion he couldn't name. "Emmett," she whispered, and the sound of his name in her voice shattered something inside him. He tried to speak, tried to move, tried to process what his eyes were seeing. But his legs suddenly felt like water, and the room began to spin around him. The woman he'd mourned, the woman he'd assumed was dead, the woman whose absence had carved a hollow space in his chest, she was here. She was alive. She was sitting in a forgotten cottage, being comforted by their daughters, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Daddy?" Lily's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Daddy, are you okay?" But Emmett wasn't okay. He would never be okay again. The careful walls he'd built around his heart, the acceptance he'd forced himself to find, the new reality he'd constructed for himself and the girls, it all came crashing down in that moment. His knees buckled, and he found himself on the floor of the cottage, tears streaming down his face as 3 years of buried grief and impossible hope collided in his chest. The girls rushed to him, their small hands on his shoulders, their voices full of concern and excitement. "We found her, Daddy," Rose said, her voice bright with triumph. "We found Mommy." And through his tears, through the overwhelming flood of emotions that threatened to drown him, Emmett looked up at the woman who had been the center of his world, the woman he'd lost and mourned and never stopped loving. "Caitlin," he managed to say, his voice broken, "you're alive." She nodded, tears streaming down her own face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The world had shifted on its axis. Nothing would ever be the same. And in that moment, surrounded by the ruins of his old life and the impossible promise of something new, Emmett Vance collapsed completely, not from despair, but from the overwhelming weight of hope he'd thought he'd lost forever. Time seemed to move in slow motion as Emmett sat on the dusty floor of the cottage, his back against the wall, trying to convince himself that what he was seeing was real. Caitlin remained in the wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on his face with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest ache all over again. The twins, seeming to understand the gravity of the moment, had positioned themselves between their parents, like tiny bridges spanning an impossible chasm. Rose held onto Emmett's arm while Lily sat beside Caitlin's chair, her small hand resting protectively on her mother's knee. "How long?" Emmett's voice came out as a whisper, rough with emotion. "How long have you been here?" Caitlin's eyes flickered toward the twins, then back to him. 8 months, she said softly. "I've been in this cottage for 8 months. 8 months, he repeated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "And before that? Before that?" She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "I don't remember, Emmett. I don't remember anything from before I woke up in a hospital in Detroit. They said I'd been in an accident, but I couldn't remember my name, couldn't remember where I came from. I had nothing, no identification, no memory of who I was, or who might be looking for me." The words hit him like physical blows. "An accident? What kind of accident?" "They said I was found by the river, unconscious, with a head injury. The doctors called it retrograde amnesia. They said it might be temporary, that my memories might come back gradually, but ... double quotes, she shrugged helplessly. "For 2.5 years, I was just a woman with no past, living in a facility for people with no families, no one to claim them." Emmett's hands clenched into fists. 2.5 years. While he'd been searching, while he'd been grieving, while he'd been trying to hold their family together, she'd been alone and lost, with no memory of the life they'd built together. "But you remember now," he said, his voice barely audible. "You remember us." "Some things," she said, tears streaming down her face. "The memories started coming back about a year ago, just flashes at first. A man with green eyes who made me laugh. 2 little girls with bright smiles. A house with white shutters and a wraparound porch. I started drawing pictures of what I could remember, trying to piece together who I might have been." "Mommy draws really good pictures," Rose interjected, her voice bright with pride. "She showed us the one of our house. It looked exactly right. You've been coming here to see her?" Emmett asked, looking between his daughters with a mixture of amazement and concern. Lily nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Patterson likes to take long walks after school. She says it's good for her arthritis. 3 weeks ago, we saw someone moving around in this cottage. Mrs. Patterson said we should mind our own business, but Rose wanted to investigate. I thought it might be a fairy," Rose added matter-of-factly, "or maybe a friendly ghost. But when we snuck back the next day, we found Mommy instead. We knew it was her right away," Lily continued. "She looked just like the pictures in Daddy's room, except older. And when she talked to us, her voice sounded like the voice in our dreams." Emmett's throat tightened. He'd kept photos of Caitlin throughout the house, unable to bear the thought of packing them away. He'd told himself it was for the girls, so they wouldn't forget their mother's face, but really, it had been for him. He'd needed to see her smile every morning, even if it was just a shadow of the woman he'd lost. "When did you realize who they were?" he asked Caitlin. "The moment I saw them," she said, her voice breaking. "Even without my complete memories. I knew. Something in my heart recognized them instantly. They have your eyes, Emmett, but they move like I do. Rose has that little dimple when she smiles, just like—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Just like you," he finished softly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 lost years pressing down on them. The cottage felt surreal, like a space outside of time where impossible things could happen. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, and somewhere outside, a bird was singing a song that sounded almost like a lullaby. "How have you been living?" Emmett asked, looking around the sparse room. "How did you end up here?" "I left the facility in Detroit when my memories started returning," Caitlin said. "I couldn't stay there anymore, not when I could remember fragments of another life. I had some money, the state had given me a small settlement for my years. as a Jane Doe, and I started traveling, following the images in my head. I remembered the name of our town, remembered the park, remembered the bridge. So you came here looking for us? She nodded. I spent weeks walking through Thornfield, hoping something would trigger more memories. I found our house, saw you and the girls through the windows, but I was too afraid to approach. What if I was wrong? What if the memories were just fantasies? What if you'd moved on, remarried, built a new life? I could never move on, Emmett said fiercely. I never stopped looking for you, never stopped hoping. I know that now, she said, glancing at the twins. These two have told me everything. About how you kept my garden alive, how you still make pancakes on Tuesday mornings, how you talk to my picture when you think no one's listening. Heat flooded Emmett's cheeks. They told you that? We hear everything, Daddy, Rose said seriously. We know you still love Mommy, even when you're sad. We also know you cry sometimes when you're doing the dishes. Lily added with the matter-of-fact honesty that only 7-year-olds possessed. Emmett looked between his daughters and his wife, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced in years. How long have you two been visiting here? Every day after school, Rose said. Mrs. Patterson thinks we're playing in the regular part of the park. We bring Mommy food from our lunches, and she tells us stories about when we were little. Stories I remembered, Caitlin said quickly. I wanted to make sure they were real memories, not just wishful thinking. So I'd tell them about the time Rose got her head stuck in the stair banister, or when Lily tried to give the cat a bath, or the Christmas morning when they both got up at 4 a.m. and tried to make coffee for us. Emmett finished, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. You burned the pot and set off the smoke alarm. You remember, Caitlin said wonderingly. I remember everything, he said. Every moment, every laugh, every fight, every perfect, imperfect day we had together. The twins looked between their parents with expressions of hope and satisfaction, as if they'd orchestrated this entire reunion. Which, Emmett realized, they essentially had. We wanted to tell you sooner, Lily said apologetically, but Mommy was scared. She said she needed time to remember more, to be sure she was really our Mommy and not just someone who looked like her. And we wanted to make sure you wouldn't be too sad, Rose added. Sometimes when you're really happy, you cry even more than when you're sad. Emmett reached out and pulled both girls into his arms, holding them tight against his chest. Over their heads, he looked at Caitlin, this woman who had been the center of his world, who had vanished from his life, who was now sitting 3 feet away, but still felt like a dream he might wake up from. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely audible. Caitlin's eyes filled with tears again. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I can just come home and pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. I don't know if I can be the wife and mother you all need me to be. I don't even know if I remember how to be part of a family anymore. We can teach you, Rose said confidently. We're really good at being a family. We've had lots of practice. Lily added solemnly. And in that moment, surrounded by the impossible and the fragile hope of what might be, Emmett felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but expanding, making room for possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. The woman he'd lost wasn't the same woman sitting before him. But maybe, just maybe, they could learn to be new people together. Maybe love could be rebuilt. Memory by memory, day by day, with 2 little girls as their guides, and the infinite patience that comes with having already lost everything once. The golden afternoon light was beginning to fade when Emmett finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his chest since the moment he'd seen Caitlin's face. The twins had dozed off in the corner of the cottage, curled up together on a pile of blankets like puppies, exhausted from the emotional weight of their secret finally being revealed. Caitlin, he said quietly, not wanting to wake the girls. I need to know what really happened. The night you disappeared, I've replayed it 1,000 times in my head, and something never made sense. She had been staring out the small window, watching the shadows lengthen across the forest floor. At his words, her whole body tensed, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold something together. "What do you mean?" she asked, but her voice was too careful, too controlled. "You went to the store to buy milk," Emmett said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It was 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. You kissed me goodbye, told me you'd be back in 20 minutes. Your car was found 3 days later in the parking lot of Pinehurst Shopping Center, but the milk was never found. Your purse was still in the car. Your phone was still in your purse. No signs of a struggle, no fingerprints, no witnesses." Caitlin's breathing had become shallow, and she was staring at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The police said, "You probably went for a walk, maybe to clear your head. They said you might have slipped by the river, hit your head, and the current carried you away. But you were found in Detroit, Caitlin. Detroit is 4 hours from here, and you weren't found by any river in our county." "Emmett, please. I hired 3 different private investigators," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I spent every penny of our savings trying to find you. I drove to every hospital, every morgue, every Jane Doe case in 5 states. I never stopped looking because nothing about your disappearance made sense." Caitlin stood up abruptly, pacing to the far corner of the cottage. Her movements were agitated, almost frantic, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You should have stopped looking." "What? What?" She turned to face him, and the expression on her face was one he'd never seen before, raw fear, mixed with something that looked almost like guilt. "I said you should have stopped looking. You should have let me stay lost." The words hit him like a physical blow. "How can you say that? Because it's true." The words burst out of her with such force that both twins stirred in their sleep. She glanced at them, then lowered her voice again. "Because I didn't just disappear, Emmett. I ran." The cottage fell silent except for the sound of their breathing and the faint rustle of wind through the trees outside. Emmett felt the world tilting again, but this time it wasn't from joy or relief. It was from the cold realization that everything he believed about his wife's disappearance was wrong. "You ran," he repeated slowly. "From what?" Caitlin sank back into the wooden chair, her face pale. "From someone who wanted to hurt our family. From someone who'd already hurt other families. From someone who gave me no choice." Who? She was. Quiet for so long that Emmett thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, distant. "Do you remember Brooks Sterling?" The name hit him like ice water. Brooks Sterling, the man who had been his supervisor at the county planning office 5 years ago. The man who had been quietly embezzling funds from public works projects, skimming money from contracts meant for road repairs and park maintenance. The man who had been arrested and sentenced to prison after Emmett discovered the discrepancies in the budget reports and reported them to the authorities. "What does Brooks have to do with this?" "He was released from prison 6 months before I disappeared," Caitlin said, her voice steady now, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation in her head 100 times. "He called me, Emmett. He called me at home while you were at work and the girls were at preschool." Emmett's hands clenched into fists. "He called you. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought it was just one call. I thought he was just angry, just blowing off steam. He told me that his wife had left him while he was in prison, that he'd lost his house, his job, his reputation. He said it was all your fault for reporting him. It was his fault for stealing in the first place," Emmett said through gritted teeth. "I know that, but he didn't see it that way. He said he was going to make you pay, make us all pay. He said he knew where the girls went to school, knew their schedules, knew when you weren't home. He said he'd been watching us." The blood drained from Emmett's face. "Watching us? For weeks, apparently. He knew that you left for work at 8:15 every morning, that I took the girls to preschool at 9, that I usually went grocery shopping on Tuesday evenings. He knew our entire routine. Jesus Christ, Caitlin, why didn't you call the police? I did, she said, her voice breaking. I called them after the third time he contacted me. They said they'd look into it, but he hadn't actually threatened violence. He hadn't broken any laws. They said to document everything and call back if... He escalated. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. The night I disappeared, he called me again. But this time, he said he was done waiting. He said he was going to take one of the girls. He didn't care which one, and make sure she had the same kind of childhood he'd given his own daughter. Foster care, he said, group homes. He said he'd make sure she was placed somewhere far away where we'd never find her. Emmett's vision blurred with rage. He threatened to kidnap Lily and Rose. He said he was parked outside Willowbrook Elementary. He said he'd be there when school let out the next day, and if I didn't come to meet him that night, alone, he'd take whichever girl walked out first. The cottage was spinning around him. So you went to meet him. I had to. I couldn't risk him hurting the girls. I couldn't risk him taking one of them and me never seeing her again. I told him I'd meet him at the Pinehurst shopping center, that I'd come alone, that I'd listen to whatever he had to say. But you didn't come home. Because he was waiting for me with two other men. Men he'd met in prison. Men who owed him favors. They forced me into another car, drove me to Detroit. They said they were going to teach me a lesson about what happens to families who destroy other families. Emmett's hands were shaking now, and he could barely breathe. They hurt you. They kept me for 3 days. They did things to make. Sure, I understood how serious they were. And then they told me I had a choice. I could go home to my family, and they would make sure something terrible happened to you or the girls. Or I could disappear. Permanently. They said they'd stage it to look like an accident, that I'd never be found, and in exchange, they'd leave my family alone. So you chose to disappear. I chose to protect you, she said fiercely. I chose to. Save my daughters from a monster who was willing to hurt babies to get revenge on their father. But the head injury, I fought back on the last day. I tried to escape, and one of them hit me with something heavy. When I woke up, I was by the river, and I didn't remember anything. I think ... I think they thought I was dead. I think they left me there to die, but someone found me and called an ambulance. The cottage was completely silent now, except for the sound of Emmett's ragged breathing. Everything made sense now, the missing memories, the location where she was found, the reason she hadn't come home even after remembering who she was. You've been hiding here because you're still afraid of him, he said. I've been hiding here because I don't know if he's still out there. I don't know if he's still watching you and the girls. I don't know if my coming home will put you all in danger again. Caitlin, that was 3 years ago. He could be anywhere by now. Or he could be right here in Thornfield waiting for me. To surface, waiting for the chance to finish what he started. Emmett stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. He walked to where she sat and knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. Look at me, he said softly. Look at me, Caitlin. She raised her eyes to his, and he saw the same woman he'd fallen in love with, but also someone who had survived unimaginable trauma, someone who had sacrificed everything to protect the people she loved. You saved us, he said. You saved our daughters. But you don't have to keep saving us alone. What if he comes back? Then we'll face him together. All of us, as a family. In the corner, one of the twins stirred, and Rose's sleepy voice drifted across the cottage. Mommy, are you crying? Caitlin quickly wiped her eyes. I'm okay, sweetheart. Just talking with Daddy. Are you coming home now? Rose asked, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. Caitlin looked at Emmett, her face full of uncertainty and hope and fear all tangled together. I don't know, baby, she said honestly. I don't know if it's safe. But Emmett was already making plans, already thinking about lawyers and police reports and protective orders. already thinking about how to build a fortress around his family that no one could breach. "It will be," he said with a conviction that surprised even him. "We'll make it safe," because now he knew the truth. Now he understood that his wife hadn't abandoned them, she had saved them. And now it was his turn to save her. As darkness settled over the cottage, Emmett found himself unable to stop staring at his wife's hands. They were different now, thinner than he remembered, with small scars across the knuckles that hadn't been there before. Every mark told a story of survival, of 3 years he knew nothing about, of a woman who had endured unimaginable trauma to keep her family safe. The twins had fallen back asleep, and the cottage felt like a sanctuary suspended between worlds. Life they'd had before, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Caitlin sat curled in the corner of the small cot, her knees drawn up to her chest, looking simultaneously like the woman he'd married and a stranger he was meeting for the first time. "Tell me about those 3 years," he said softly. "All of it. I need to understand what you went through." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on the patchwork quilt. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "The first 2 years are still mostly fragments," she said. "I remember waking up in the hospital in Detroit with a crushing headache and no idea who I was. They told me I'd been found by a jogger, unconscious by the Rouge River. The doctor said I had a severe concussion, some broken ribs, bruises everywhere. They thought I'd been mugged and thrown in the river." Emmett's jaw tightened. "But you weren't mugged." "No, I was beaten by 3 men who wanted to send a message, but I couldn't remember that then. All I knew was that no one came looking for me. No missing person reports that matched my description. No family searching for a woman found half dead by a river. For weeks, I lay in that hospital bed thinking I must be the kind of person no one would miss." The words cut through him like glass. While she'd been lying in a hospital bed, believing she was unloved and forgotten, he'd been going insane with worry, searching everywhere except the one place she'd actually been. "What happened when you were released?" "They transferred me to a state facility for people with traumatic brain injuries. Eastbrook Manor. It wasn't a bad place, just empty, filled with people who had nowhere else to go. I spent my days in therapy, trying to remember who I was, and my nights wondering if I even wanted to remember. She paused, her fingers still working the quilt's edge. "There was a woman there named Mrs. Chen, elderly, sweet, reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. She taught me to knit, to draw, to find small joys in the routine. She said memories were like seeds. Sometimes they needed time to take root before they could grow." Emmett realized she was talking about Mrs. Patterson, the resemblance that had drawn his daughters to trust this stranger who turned out to be their mother. "When did the memories start coming back?" "About 2 years in. Little things at first, the scent of vanilla making me think of birthday cakes, the sound of children laughing reminding me of something precious I'd lost. I started dreaming about green eyes and gentle hands. I'd wake up crying and not know why." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I began drawing the images from my dreams. A house with white shutters, 2 little girls with matching backpacks, a man reading bedtime, stories with different voices for each character. The staff thought it was therapeutic fiction, my brain creating an idealized family to fill the void. But you knew it was real. Part of me did. The part that felt hollow whenever I drew those pictures, like I was reaching for something just beyond my grasp. I started asking questions. Where exactly had I been found? Were there any other missing person cases from around that time? The social worker finally helped me access the police files." Emmett leaned forward. "What did you find?" "Nothing at first. Then I realized I was looking in the wrong place. The injury had affected my memory of time. I thought I'd been missing for days, maybe weeks. When I expanded the search to months, I found it. A missing person report from Thornfield, Michigan. A woman named Caitlin Cruz Vance who had disappeared on her way to buy milk. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I saw the photo they'd used my driver's license picture, and it was like looking at a ghost. I knew that face, but I also knew I wasn't the same person anymore. The woman in that photo looked happy, confident, loved. I felt like an imposter even thinking about claiming her life. You weren't an imposter. You were hurt, traumatized. I was broken, she said firmly. And I was terrified. Because as the memories came back, so did the fear. I remembered Brooke Sterling's voice on the phone. I remembered the threats. I remembered choosing to disappear, rather than risk harm coming to my family. What if coming forward put you all in danger again? Emmett ran his hands through his hair, frustrated by his own helplessness. So you ran again. I left Eastbrook and came to Thornfield. I needed to see for myself that you were all okay, that my sacrifice had meant something. I found work cleaning. Offices at night jobs that paid cash, that didn't require extensive background checks. I rented a tiny room above the old bakery on Main Street and spent my days walking through town, learning about the life I'd left behind. You were here for months without me knowing? She nodded. I watched you drop the girls off at school. I saw you at the grocery store, buying the same brands I used to buy. I followed you to the cemetery on my birthday and watched you leave flowers on an empty grave. Her voice broke. You looked so tired, Emmett, so worn down. I wanted to run to you, but I was terrified that my presence would destroy what little peace you'd found. Peace? He said incredulously. Caitlin, there was no peace. There was survival, barely. There was going through the motions for the girl's sake. But peace? I haven't had a peaceful moment since the night you disappeared. I didn't know that then. From the outside, you looked like you were managing. You looked like a father who had learned to live with his loss and move forward. I thought maybe you were better off without me. Never, he said fiercely. Not for a single day. I know that now. The girls told me about the photos you kept, about the conversations you had with my picture when you thought no one was listening. They told me about the night terrors you have, about how you sometimes sit in your car in the driveway for an hour before coming inside, because the house feels too empty. Emmett felt heat flood his cheeks. He'd thought he'd been protecting the girls from his grief, but apparently 7-year-olds saw everything. They also told me about the good things, Caitlin continued. About the pancake breakfasts and the bedtime stories. About how you learned to braid their hair and paint their nails. About how you made sure they felt loved and secure, even when you were falling apart inside. She reached across the space between them and touched his hand gently. You saved them, Emmett. You kept them whole when everything was broken. You gave them a childhood filled with love even when your heart was shattered. I just did what any father would do. No, she said firmly. You did what the best fathers do. You put their needs before your own pain. You chose their happiness over your grief. You made them feel safe in a world that had suddenly become terrifying and uncertain. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each processing the weight of what had been shared. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the faint hum of traffic from the main road. I found this cottage 3 months ago, Caitlin said eventually. The Park Service had abandoned it, but it was dry and safe. It felt like a place where I could exist between worlds, close enough to watch over you all, far enough away to keep you safe if Sterling was still looking for me. And you've been living here alone all this time? Until 3 weeks ago, when 2 little girls decided to investigate what they thought might be a fairy hiding in the woods. She smiled softly. They weren't afraid of me at all. They just walked right up and introduced themselves, as if finding their supposedly dead mother living in an abandoned cottage was the most natural thing in the world. That sounds like them. They're remarkable, Emmett. Strong and brave and so full of love. They got that from you. They got it from both of us, he said quietly. They got your compassion, your intuition, your ability to see the best in people, even when the world has given you every reason to be cynical. As if sensing they were being discussed, Rose stirred in her sleep and mumbled something that sounded like pancakes. Both parents smiled, and for a moment, it felt almost normal, like they were just a family sharing quiet conversation after their daughters had fallen asleep. But the weight of their circumstances pressed down on them again. And Emmett found himself grappling with a new kind of grief. Not the grief of loss this time, but the grief of time stolen, of years they would never get back, of a family fractured by forces beyond their control. We're going to figure this out, he said, as much to convince himself as her. We're going to find a way to be a family again. Caitlin looked at him with eyes full of hope and fear in equal measure. I want that more than anything. But I need to know that coming home won't put them in danger. Then we'll make sure it doesn't, whatever it takes. In the corner, both twins sighed in their sleep, and the sound was like a promise that love could survive the darkest circumstances, that families could be rebuilt from broken pieces, and that sometimes the longest journeys were the ones that led back home. The next morning brought unexpected challenges and small miracles in equal measure. Emmett had called in sick to work, the first time in 3 years. He'd taken a day off that wasn't for the girls' doctor appointments or school events. He'd spent the night in the cottage, sleeping fitfully in the old wooden chair while Caitlin and the twins shared the narrow cot. When dawn broke through the small windows, painting everything in soft gold light, it felt like waking up in a dream he wasn't sure he wanted to end. "Daddy," Rose whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Mrs. Patterson is going to wonder where we are." Reality crashed back over him like cold water. Mrs. Patterson would arrive at the house at 7:30 to watch the girls before school. When she found them gone, she'd panic, call the police, assume the worst. He checked his watch. 6:45 a.m. They had 45 minutes to get home and act like their world hadn't completely shifted on its axis. "We have to go," he said, looking apologetically at Caitlin. "But we'll be back. After school, we'll figure out what comes next." She nodded, but he could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. The fear that this reunion had been nothing more than a beautiful dream, that he might not return. "Mommy," Lily said seriously, "you have to promise to stay here. No matter what happens, you have to promise you won't disappear again." "I promise, sweetheart," Caitlin said, but her voice was shaky. "No," Rose said, crossing her arms. "That's not good enough. We need a real promise, a pinky promise." Both twins extended their small fingers toward their mother, and after a moment's hesitation, Caitlin linked her pinkies with theirs. "I promise I won't disappear," she said solemnly. "I promise I'll be here when you come back." The drive home was surreal. Emmett kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the twins, who sat quietly in their car seats, looking like they were processing something too big for their 7-year-old minds. When they pulled into the driveway of their house on Maple Grove Avenue, everything looked exactly the same, but Emmett felt like he was seeing it through different eyes. Mrs. Patterson was just walking up the front porch steps when they arrived. "There you are," she called out, relief evident in her voice. "I was beginning to worry when I saw your car was gone." "We went for an early morning drive," Emmett said, the lie feeling strange on his tongue. "The girls wanted to see the sunrise over the lake." The twins looked at him with expressions that were equal parts impressed and concerned. They weren't used to their father telling stories that weren't completely true. "Well, that sounds lovely," Mrs. Patterson said, though she gave Emmett a searching look. "You look tired, dear. Are you feeling all right?" "Just didn't sleep well," he said, which was true enough. "I think I might work from home today." After Mrs. Patterson left and the girls were at school, Emmett found himself alone in the house for the first time since finding Caitlin. He walked through the rooms like a stranger, seeing everything with new eyes. The photos of Caitlin that he'd kept displayed everywhere suddenly felt different, not like memorials to someone lost, but like windows into a past they might actually be able to reclaim. He spent the morning making phone calls. First to Detective Morrison, the officer who had handled Caitlin's missing person case. Morrison was retired now, but he listened carefully as Emmett explained the situation and agreed to meet later that afternoon. Next, he called his lawyer, Sarah Walsh, who specialized in family law. Her reaction was a mixture of amazement and concern. "Emmett, this is incredible news," she said. "But we need to be very careful about how we handle this. There are legal implications, insurance payouts, death certificates, not to mention the criminal aspects of what you're describing." "I just want my family to be safe," he said. "I understand. Let me make some calls. We'll need to involve the police, probably the FBI given the interstate nature of the crime, but we'll do it carefully. First priority is protection for all of you." The afternoon pickup at school felt like performing in a play where he'd forgotten his lines. The twins maintained their usual cheerful chatter with Mrs. Patterson, but Emmett could see the anticipation building in their eyes as 3:15 approached. "Can we go to the park again today?" Lily asked as they drove away from school. "Please, Daddy," Rose added. "We want to show you more of the pretty places we found." Mrs. Patterson smiled. These two have become quite the explorers lately. Always wanting to venture deeper into the woods. I keep telling them to be careful of strangers, but they insist they know every tree and bird in that forest. If only she knew, Emmett thought. When they reached the cottage, they found Caitlin sitting by the window, a drawing pad in her lap. She looked up as they entered, and the relief on her face when she saw them was heartbreaking. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back," she admitted. "We made a pinky promise," Rose said firmly. "And we always keep our promises." "Always," Lily echoed. Over the next hour, they began to establish new routines. Emmett had brought groceries, real food, not just the snacks the girls had been sneaking from their lunches. Caitlin showed them the drawings she'd been working on, detailed sketches of the cottage, the surrounding woods, and remarkably accurate portraits of all three of them. "I've been practicing," she said shyly. "I wanted to capture these moments. In case ... double quotes. In case what?" Emmett asked. "In case this is all we get. In case it's not safe for me to come home." The twins looked between their parents with expressions of determination that reminded Emmett powerfully of their mother. "It will be safe," Lily said with absolute conviction. "We'll make it safe." "How?" Caitlin asked gently. "By being brave," Rose said. "And by sticking together. And by telling the police about the bad man who hurt you." "It's not that simple, sweetheart," Emmett said. "Yes, it is," Lily insisted. "Bad people should be in jail. Good people should be with their families. It's not complicated, Daddy. Grown-ups just make it complicated." That evening, as they shared a simple dinner of sandwiches and soup, something shifted. The conversation flowed more naturally, punctuated by the twins' stories about school and friends. Caitlin really laughed, for the first time since he'd found her, and the sound filled the cottage with warmth. "Tell us about when we were babies," Rose requested, curling up against her mother's side. "You want to hear about the time you two decided to redecorate the living room with peanut butter?" Caitlin asked. "Yes." Both girls CHORUSED. As Caitlin told the story, how 2-year-old twins had systematically covered every surface within their reach with JIF extra crunchy. Emmett watched his family and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a sense of rightness, of pieces clicking back into place. "What about you, Daddy?" Lily asked. "What do you remember about when we were little?" "I remember your first steps," he said. "Rose, you took yours holding onto the coffee table, moving along it like you were walking a tightrope. But Lily, you just stood up in the middle of the room one day and walked straight to your mother, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I always knew where I wanted to go," Lily said solemnly. "You still do," Caitlin said, stroking her daughter's hair. As the sun set and the cottage filled with the gentle sounds of a family reconnecting, Emmett felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was lost forever: hope for the future. They still had mountains to climb, dragons to slay, legal and emotional hurdles that seemed insurmountable. But for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't facing them alone. And as he watched his daughters help their mother clean up their simple dinner, chattering about plans for tomorrow and the day after that, he realized they were already building something new. Not the family they used to be, that was gone forever, but something different, something stronger. Something forged by loss and tempered by hope. Something that just might be unbreakable this time. The first sign that their carefully constructed new reality was about to crumble came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after they'd found Caitlin. Emmett was making breakfast when his phone rang. Detective Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and something in the pit of his stomach turned cold. "Emmett," Morrison's voice was tense. "We need to talk. Can you come to the station this morning? And don't bring the girls." "What's wrong?" Emmett asked, but he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Brooks Sterling was released on parole 2 days ago. Early release for good behavior. "I just found out this morning when I ran his name through the system." The coffee mug slipped from Emmett's hand, shattering on the kitchen floor. The twins looked up from their cereal, alarm creeping into their faces. "That's impossible," Emmett said, his voice barely a whisper. He had 8 years left on his sentence. Prison overcrowding, model prisoner status, some lawyer who knew how to work the system. "Emmett, there's more." His parole officer lost contact with him yesterday. He missed his check-in, and his halfway house says he never came back Tuesday night. Emmett sank into a chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "He's looking for us. We don't know that for certain, but we can't take chances. I've already called your lawyer. We're putting together a protection detail, but I need you and your family somewhere safe until we figure out our next move." "Daddy?" Lily's voice was small and frightened. "What's wrong?" Emmett looked at his daughters, his brave, innocent daughters, who had just gotten their mother back, and felt rage burn through him like fire. "Pack your backpacks, girls. We're going to visit Mommy earlier today." The drive to the cottage felt like the longest 20 minutes of his life. Every car behind them could be Sterling. Every stranger on the sidewalk could be watching. By the time they reached the hidden path through the woods, Emmett's hands were shaking. They found Caitlin sitting outside the cottage in the morning sun, sketching the surrounding trees. She looked up as they approached, and her face immediately changed when she saw their expressions. "What happened?" she asked, standing quickly. "Sterling's out," Emmett said simply. The color drained from her face, and she stumbled backward as if the words had physically struck her. No, that's not possible. He had years left. Parole, and he's missing. His officer can't find him." Caitlin's breathing became rapid and shallow. She pressed her back against the cottage wall, her eyes darting to the tree line as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow he knows I'm alive. We don't know that. He knows," she said, her voice rising. "Why else would he run? He's been waiting for this, planning for this. He never forgot what he wanted to do to our family." The twins moved closer to their parents, sensing the fear that was crackling between them like electricity. "What does this mean?" Rose asked in a small voice. Before either parent could answer, they heard the sound of footsteps on the path. Everyone froze. Emmett positioned himself in front of his family, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps grew closer, and then Mrs. Patterson appeared through the trees, her face flushed from the walk and her eyes wide with concern. "There you are," she said, breathing heavily. "I've been looking everywhere for you. When I came to the house this morning and found it empty, I was so worried." Your car was gone. The girls' backpacks were missing. She stopped abruptly when she saw Kaith. Lynn. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Mrs. Patterson's eyes moved from Caitlin's face to the cottage behind her, to the twins who were clinging to their parents, to Emmett's stricken expression. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Caitlin? Is that really you? Really you?" Caitlin stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson." The elderly woman sat down heavily on a fallen log, her hand pressed to her chest. "But you're dead. You've been dead for 3 years. I attended your memorial service. I helped organize the meal afterward." "It's complicated," Emmett said helplessly. "Complicated?" Mrs. Patterson's voice rose. "Complicated doesn't begin to cover this. Do you realize what this means? There are legal implications, insurance implications." The whole community mourned. "For you, Caitlin. Your parents still visit your grave every Sunday." "My parents?" Caitlin's voice cracked. "Your mother never stopped believing you might come home. She said a mother knows when her baby is truly gone, and she said you weren't gone. We thought it was just grief talking, but—" Mrs. Patterson shook her head in amazement. "Where have you been?" Before Caitlin could answer, Emmett's phone rang again. This time it was Sarah Walsh, his lawyer. "Emmett, we have a problem, a big one." "What now?" "Someone called the FBI field office this morning. Anonymous tip about Caitlin being alive. They're sending agents to question you this afternoon." "And Emmett? They're also sending Child Protective Services." The world tilted sideways. CPS? Why? Because if Caitlin has been alive all this time and hiding from her family, they're going to want to know why. They're going to question whether the girls are safe, whether there's something about this situation that puts them at risk. "She wasn't hiding from us," Emmett said desperately. "She was protecting us." "I know that, and you know that, but try explaining that to a caseworker who sees a woman who faked her own death, and a father who's been lying about his wife's whereabouts. They're going to assume the worst until proven otherwise." Emmett ended the call and looked at his family, his wife, who was staring at Mrs. Patterson with a mixture of hope and terror. His daughters, who were trying to understand why the adults around them seemed so frightened. The elderly woman who had become their surrogate grandmother and was now looking at them like strangers. "They're coming for us," he said quietly. "The FBI Child Services." Someone called in a tip. Who would do that? Caitlin asked. Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "I may have mentioned seeing you to my neighbor, Mrs. Henley. I was so shocked, I needed to tell someone. She said she was going to call the authorities. Because hiding from your family isn't natural, it isn't right." Emmett felt the careful world they'd been building collapse around them. "Mrs. Patterson, you don't understand. Caitlin didn't choose to leave. She was forced to disappear by someone who threatened to hurt the girls. Then why didn't she go to the police? Why didn't she get help? She did. They said there wasn't enough evidence to act on. So when he escalated his threats, she made an impossible choice to save her family." Mrs. Patterson looked between them, her expression softening but still troubled. "And now this man is free again? As of Tuesday. And he's missing." The implications of their situation crashed over all of them at once. Sterling was out there somewhere, possibly closing in. The authorities were coming, possibly to separate them. Their secret was blown, and their sanctuary was compromised. "We have to run," Caitlin said suddenly. "All of us. We have to disappear before they find us." "No," Emmett said firmly. "No more running, no more hiding. No more letting fear make our choices for us." "Then what?" she asked desperately. "How do we protect them? We fight. We tell the truth, all of it, to everyone who will listen. We trust the system to protect us instead of assuming it will fail us. The system failed me before. Then we make sure it doesn't fail us again." Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her expression resolute. "If what you're telling me is true, and I believe it is, then you're not facing this alone. I'll testify on your behalf. I'll tell them what kind of father Emmett has been, what kind of man he is. I'll tell them about these precious girls and how much they love both their parents. Mrs. Patterson, Emmett said, his voice thick with emotion, you don't have to. Yes, I do. This family has been through enough. It's time for the truth to come out, and it's time for you to be safe. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the forest. Official voices called out instructions. Footsteps approached, too many to be casual visitors. Emmett Vance, FBI. We need to speak with you. The twins pressed closer to their parents, and Caitlin's breathing became rapid again. This was it, the moment when everything they'd been trying to protect would be laid bare, examined, judged by strangers who didn't understand the impossible choices they'd been forced to make. It's going to be okay, Emmett said, though he wasn't. Sure, he believed it himself. We're going to tell them everything, and we're going to trust that the truth is enough. But as armed agents emerged from the trees, as official badges flashed in the morning sunlight, as his daughters clung to him in fear, Emmett couldn't help but wonder if sometimes the truth was just another word for the thing that destroyed everything. You were trying to save. The FBI agents who emerged from the forest weren't the intimidating figures Emmett had expected. Agent Sarah Chun, a slight woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, approached them with her hands visible and her voice calm. Mr. Vance, I'm Agent Chun, and this is Agent Rodriguez. We're here to help, not to arrest anyone. We understand this is a complicated situation. Behind her, Agent Rodriguez, a tall man with graying temples, nodded respectfully to Caitlin. Ma'am, we're aware that you've been through a traumatic experience. We're here to ensure your family's safety and to get the full story. Emmett felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. You know about Sterling? We know enough to take this very seriously, Agent Chun said. Detective Morrison briefed us on the original threats and the circumstances of your wife's disappearance. What we need now is your complete cooperation in building a case that will put Sterling away permanently. A second vehicle had arrived, and from it emerged a middle-aged woman with a badge identifying her as Janet Torres from Child Protective Services. Emmett's stomach tightened again, but Agent Chun seemed to anticipate his concern. Ms. Torres is here as a formality, she said. We want to ensure the children's safety during this process. From what we've been told, you've been an exemplary father under impossible circumstances. Daddy, Rose whispered, tugging on his shirt. Are we in trouble? Before Emmett could answer, Lily stepped forward with the same serious expression she'd inherited from her mother. We're not in trouble, she said firmly to the adults. Our mommy didn't do anything wrong. She saved us from a very bad man, and now she's home where she belongs. Agent Chun crouched down to Lily's eye level. That's exactly what we're here to find out, sweetheart. Can you tell me about finding your mommy? What followed was the most remarkable 45 minutes of Emmett's life. His 7-year-old daughters, with the clear logic that only young people possessed, laid out the entire situation for the agents. They explained how they'd been visiting their mother, bringing her food, listening to her stories about when they were babies. They described their mother's fear and their father's sadness, and how they'd known that their family needed to be together again. She wasn't hiding from us, Rose said earnestly. She was protecting us. That's what mommies do. And now she needs protecting too, Lily added. From the bad man who hurt her. Throughout their testimony, Caitlin sat silent, tears streaming down her face. When the twins finished, Agent Rodriguez turned to her. Mrs. Vance, we need to hear your story. All of it. We understand this is difficult, but we need details if we're going to find Sterling and build a case against him. What happened next was the bravest thing Emmett had ever witnessed. Caitlin, who had spent 3 years hiding from her trauma, who had lived in fear and isolation, began to speak. Her voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she continued. She told them about the phone calls, the escalating threats, the impossible choice she'd been forced to make. She described the kidnapping, the 3 days of terror, the beating that had left her with amnesia. She spoke about waking up in a Detroit hospital with no memory of who she was, about the years in the facility, about the gradual return of her memories and her decision to watch her family from afar rather than risk their safety. "I couldn't take the chance," she said, her voice breaking. "If coming home meant that man might hurt my daughters, then staying away was the only choice I could live with." Agent Chun had been taking notes throughout the interview, but she stopped, writing, and looked directly at Caitlin. "Mrs. Vance, what you did, the sacrifice you made, it was extraordinary. But now we need you to be brave in a different way. We need you to help us find Sterling so he can never threaten another family again." "How?" "By coming forward publicly. By filing charges for kidnapping, assault, terroristic threats. By being the witness that puts him away permanently." Caitlin's breathing became rapid again. "But if I do that, if I go public, he'll know where to find us." "Not if we find him first," Agent Rodriguez said. "And Mrs. Vance, you're not doing this alone. We have resources, protection details, safe houses if necessary. We also have 3 years of investigating to catch up on. Sterling didn't vanish. Completely during that time, he left traces, and we're going to follow every one of them." One of them. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "You'll also have the support of this entire community. Caitlin, your family has been loved and looked after for 3 years. That doesn't stop now." Miss Torres from CPS, who had been observing the family dynamics throughout the interview, finally spoke. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance, I want you to know that I see no reason to recommend any changes to your family situation. These children are clearly loved, well cared for, and remarkably resilient. What I'd like to recommend is family counseling to help all of you process this trauma and rebuild your relationships in a healthy way." Emmett felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him over. "There's one more thing," Agent Chun said. "We need to move quickly. Every hour Sterling is free is another hour he might be getting closer to you. Mrs. Vance, are you willing to go on record today? Are you ready to tell your story officially?" Caitlin looked at her daughters, who nodded encouragingly. She looked at Emmett, who reached out and took her hand. She looked at Mrs. Patterson, who smiled with tears in her eyes. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady now, strong. "I'm ready to fight back." The next 6 hours were a whirlwind of official statements, evidence gathering, and legal procedures. Caitlin was interviewed extensively by both FBI agents and local detectives. Emmett provided financial records, phone logs, and documentation of his 3-year search for his wife. The twins, with remarkable composure, answered questions about their mother's condition and their secret visits to the cottage. Most importantly, they learned that their decision to come forward had been the right one. Sterling's parole officer revealed that he had been asking questions about his former victims, specifically requesting information about the families of the people who had testified against him. A multi-state manhunt was already underway. He made a mistake coming back to Michigan, Detective Morrison told them as the afternoon wore on. This state has some of the strongest laws regarding crimes against families. When we find him, and we will find him, he's going away for the rest of his life. By evening, the cottage in the woods had been transformed into a crime scene, but also into something else. The place where a family had finally decided to stop running and start fighting Dot as they prepared to leave to go home. Together, for the first time in 3 years, Lily tugged on Agent Chun's sleeve. "Are you going to catch the bad man?" she asked. Agent Chun knelt down and looked directly into the little girl's eyes. "We're going to do everything in our power to make sure he never hurts anyone again. That's a promise." "Good," Lily said solemnly, "because our family has been broken long enough. It's time for us to be safe and happy again. And as they walked back through the forest together, Emmett and Kathleen side by side, the twins between them, Mrs. Patterson following behind like a protective grandmother. They weren't running anymore. They were walking toward home. The call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Saturday morning, exactly 10 days after they'd walked out of the forest together. Emmett answered his phone with the same mix of hope and dread he'd felt every time it rang since going public with their story. "Mr. Vance, this is Agent Chun. We got him." 3 simple words that changed everything. "Sterling?" Emmett's voice was barely a whisper. "We found him in a motel outside Detroit, drunk and ranting about unfinished business. He had photos of your family, your house, the girls' school. He'd been planning something, Mr. Vance, but he'll never get the chance to act on it. He's in federal custody, and this time, there won't be any early parole." Emmett sank into the kitchen chair, his legs suddenly weak with relief. From upstairs, he could hear the sounds of his family waking up, Kathleen's soft voice reading to the twins in what had once again become their shared bedroom. For the first time in 10 days, those sounds didn't carry an undercurrent of fear. "Thank you," he managed to say. "Thank you for bringing him in. Thank you for being brave enough to come forward. Your wife's testimony is going to put Sterling away for multiple life sentences. He's facing federal kidnapping charges, assault, terroristic threats, and now stalking and planning to harm minors. He's never going to threaten another family again." When Emmett hung up the phone, he sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment, letting the reality wash over him. It was over. After 3 years of grief, 8 months of secret hope, and 10 days of protected fear, it was finally over. "Daddy?" Rose appeared at the top of the stairs in her princess pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. "Who was on the phone?" "Come here." "Sweetheart," he said, and when she reached him, he lifted her into his lap. "That was Agent Chun. The bad man has been caught. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Rose's eyes went wide. "Really? Forever and ever? Forever and ever?" Lily appeared next, followed by Kathleen, who was wearing one of Emmett's old tie-shirts and looking more like the woman he'd married than she had since her return. "Is everything okay?" Kathleen asked, reading the expression on his face. "Sterling's in custody. It's over, Kathleen. We're safe." The transformation that came over her face was remarkable. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 10 days melted away. The careful way she'd been moving through their house like a guest, unsure of her welcome, disappeared. For the first time since coming home, she looked like she truly belonged. "There, we're safe," she repeated, as if testing the words. "All of us, all of us." What followed was the kind of morning Emmett had dreamed about for 3 years. Pancakes shaped like animals, Kathleen's specialty, that she'd remembered how to make. Coffee shared on the front porch while the twins played in the yard. Neighbors stopping by to welcome Kathleen home officially, now that the story was public. And the danger was past. Mrs. Patterson arrived around noon with a casserole and tears in her eyes. "I've been praying for this moment," she said, hugging Kathleen tightly, "praying that our girl would come home safe." "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," Kathleen said. "I'm sorry for all the secrets." "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You did what you had to do to protect your babies. There's nothing to forgive." The afternoon brought more visitors. Detective Morrison stopped by to deliver the official news and to shake Emmett's hand. "You never gave up," he said. "Even when the rest of us started to lose hope, you never stopped believing she was out there." Sarah Walsh, their lawyer, arrived with a stack of paperwork that would officially restore Kathleen's legal status. "It's mostly formalities now," she explained. "The insurance company will need to reverse their payout, and there are some tax implications, but nothing that can't be handled. As far as the law is concerned, Kathleen Cruz Vance was never really dead. She was just missing." But the most meaningful moment came that evening when the family gathered in the living room for their first official movie night in 3 years. Caitlin sat on the couch with a twin curled into each side, and Emmett sat in his chair, marveling at how right it felt to have his family complete again. "Mommy," Lily said during a quiet moment in the film, "are you really staying forever now?" "Forever and always," Caitlin said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "No more hiding, no more being afraid. We're a family again." "We were always a family," Rose corrected wisely. "We just weren't all in the same place." Later that night, after the girls were asleep and the house had settled into comfortable quiet, Emmett and Caitlin sat together on their bed, the bed that had felt too large and too empty for 3 years, and now felt exactly right. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out this was all a dream," Caitlin said, her head resting on his shoulder. "If it is, then we're both having the same dream," Emmett replied, stroking her hair. "I'm different now," she said quietly. "The woman you married, she was brave in small ways, domestic ways. I don't know if I can be her again." "I don't want you to be her again," Emmett said, and he meant it. "The woman who sacrificed everything to save her family, who survived trauma that would have broken most people, who found the courage to come forward and help catch a dangerous criminal. That woman is extraordinary. That's the woman I fell in love with all over again." She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I love you too. I never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't remember your name." "How did you know?" "In the hospital, when you had no memories, how did you know you were missing something important?" She smiled softly, "Because every day felt incomplete. Like I was waiting for something, or someone, to make me whole again. I drew pictures of green eyes for 2 years before I remembered they were yours." The house creaked softly around them, settling into its new reality. Tomorrow would bring challenges, counseling sessions to help them all heal, legal meetings to finalize Caitlin's restoration, conversations with the girls about the things they'd experienced. But tonight, they were simply a family again. "The girls want to plant a garden," Caitlin said. "They said you kept trying to maintain mine, but you're not very good with flowers." Emmett laughed. "They're not wrong. I killed every rosebush you ever planted. Then it's a good thing I'm home to save them." Save them. As they prepared for sleep, their first full night together in 3 years, Emmett marveled at the journey that had brought them back to this moment. They weren't the same people who had said goodbye over a simple trip to buy milk. They were stronger, tested by fire and forged by love and loss and the determination to find each other again. The twins were different, too wise beyond their years, resilient in ways that both broke his heart and filled him with pride. They had navigated the adult world of secrets and dangers with remarkable grace, never losing faith that their family could be whole again. And Caitlin, she carried scars now, visible and invisible, but she also carried a strength that came from surviving the unthinkable. She had faced down monsters, literally and figuratively, and emerged victorious. "Emmett?" she whispered in the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for coming home." Outside their window, the wind rustled through the trees of Thornfield, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed midnight. A new day was beginning for the Vance family, the first day of their second chance at the life they were meant to have got, and for the first time in 3 years. When Emmett closed his eyes, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. 1 year later, Emmett stood at the podium of the Thornfield Community Center, looking out at an audience of faces that had become familiar over the months since their story went public. Families who had lost loved ones, parents searching for missing persons, survivors of domestic violence, and people who simply needed to believe that broken things could be mended. "When my wife disappeared 3 years ago," he began, his voice steady now in a way it hadn't been during those first interviews, "I thought my world had ended. I thought the best I could hope for was survival, for my daughter's sake. I never imagined that our story would end not just with healing, but with hope for others." In the front row, Caitlin sat with Lily and Rose, now 8 years old and radiating the confidence that came from being genuinely secure in their family's love. The twins had insisted on coming to tonight's meeting of the Hope Foundation, the organization that had grown organically from their family's experience. It had started small. After Sterling's conviction made national news, families from across the country had reached out to the Vances. Some were searching for missing loved ones. Others were survivors of threats and violence who had been forced to make impossible choices. All of them found comfort in knowing they weren't alone. The foundation isn't about us, Emmett continued. It's about the power of never giving up, even when hope seems impossible. It's about the truth that love doesn't end when someone disappears, and that families can be rebuilt even after the worst trauma. Agent Chun, who had become not just a contact but a friend, raised her hand from the audience. "Tell them about the database," she prompted. Emmett smiled. The National Missing Persons Cross-Reference Database had been Caitlin's idea. Working with law enforcement agencies across multiple states, they had created a system that connected missing person reports with unidentified individuals in hospitals, care facilities, and morgues. In its first year, the database had reunited 43 families. "My wife spent 2.5 years as a Jane Doe because no one thought to look for a missing person from Michigan in a Detroit hospital," Emmett said. "That shouldn't happen to anyone. Every person who goes missing deserves to be found, and every family deserves answers." Mrs. Patterson, now an official volunteer coordinator for the foundation, stood up from her seat. "I want to tell you what I've seen this past year," she said to the audience. "I've watched this family transform their trauma into purpose. I've seen them help other families find hope when all seemed lost. But most importantly, I've watched 2 remarkable young ladies learn that their own experience can be a gift to others." She gestured to Lily and Rose, who exchanged one of their meaningful looks before standing up together. "We want to tell you something," Lily said, her voice clear and strong. "A lot of kids have parents who go missing or who have to go away to stay safe. And those kids think it's their fault or that their family is broken forever. But that's not true," Rose added. "Families are stronger than the bad things that happen to them. Even when they're apart, they're still connected by love. And love always finds a way." The audience was silent, hanging on every word from these wise 8-year-olds who had lived through more than most adults. "We started a program at our school," Lily continued, "for kids whose families are going through hard times. We call it the Bridge Club because we help them build bridges back to being happy. And we want other kids to know," Rose said, "that if their mommy or daddy is missing, they shouldn't stop hoping. Because miracles really do happen. We're proof." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Emmett barely heard it. He was too busy marveling at his daughters, who had taken their experience and transformed it into compassion for others. They regularly corresponded with children from other families served by the foundation, sharing their story and offering hope to kids who felt alone and forgotten. After the meeting, as families mingled and shared their own stories, a young mother approached Caitlin with tears in her eyes. "My husband has been missing for 6 months, she said. "The police say he probably left voluntarily, that men sometimes just walk away from their responsibilities. But I know something happened to him. I know he wouldn't leave our baby." Caitlin took the woman's hands gently. "What's your name?" "Jessica. Jessica Morrison." "Jessica, 6 months ago, I would have told you to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. But now I know something different. I know that the impossible happens more often than we think. And I know that whether your husband comes home or not, you and your baby are going to be okay, because you're not facing this alone anymore." She handed Jessica a card with the foundation's information. "We have support groups, legal resources, and a network of people who understand exactly what you're going through. And Jessica, we never give up, ever." Later that evening, as the family drove home through the streets of Thornfield, Rose asked the question that had been on her mind all night. "Daddy, how many families do you think will help?" "I don't know, sweetheart." "How many do you think need help?" "All of them," Lily said seriously. "Every family that's scared or sad or broken. We should help all of them." "That's a big job," Emmett said, smiling at his daughters in the rearview mirror. "We're good at big jobs," Rose replied matter-of-factly. "We found Mommy when everyone said it was impossible." As they pulled into their driveway, the same driveway where Emmett had once sat in his car, too overwhelmed by grief to face another empty evening, he marveled at how completely their world had changed. The house still had white shutters and a wraparound porch, but now it overflowed with life again. Caitlin's garden bloomed with flowers that actually survived under her care. The twins' laughter echoed from the backyard where they'd built a fort in the old oak tree, and in the living room, on the mantel next to their family photos, sat a growing collection of letters from families they'd helped. Thank you notes from people who had found their missing loved ones. Updates from survivors who had found the courage to leave dangerous situations. Photos from children in the bridge club who had rediscovered their own strength. "You know what the best part is?" Caitlin said as they tucked the twins into bed that night. "What?" Emmett asked. "The best part is that our story doesn't end with us getting our happy ending. It ends with us giving other people hope for their own." Standing in the doorway of their daughter's room, watching Lily and Rose settle into sleep with the security that came from knowing their family was whole and safe, Emmett realized she was right. Their journey through loss and trauma and reunion had become something bigger than just their own healing. It had become proof that love endures, that hope survives even the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the most broken families become the strongest ones. And somewhere out there, in hospital rooms and police stations and living rooms where families waited for news that might never come, people were holding onto their story. People were choosing to hope instead of despair, to fight instead of surrender, to believe in miracles instead of accepting defeat. Because if a single dad and his twin daughters could find their missing wife and mother after 3 years of separation and trauma, then anything was possible. If you believe in the power of hope, in the strength of families, and in miracles that happen when we refuse to give up, then their story isn't just about them. It's about all of us, and the endless possibility that tomorrow might be the day everything changes. It's about the truth that love never really disappears. It just sometimes takes longer to find its way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.